Hey, all you wiretappers out there. Gary Jenkins back here in the studio of Gangland Wire. I'm a retired Kansas City Police Intelligence Unit detective doing a podcast mainly about organized crime. We might stray into drugs every once in a while, but primarily about Italian-based organized crime. And then sometimes we get into Irish-based organized crime. I've done a story on the Westies in the past and a few other stories like that. So today we're going to talk about the crossing of the Irish and the Italians in Boston area, which is a really well-known, famous story, a lot of great characters. And I have with me a man who wrote a book about this, Springs Toledo. Welcome, Springs.
Thank you very much, Gary. Happy to be here.
Great. Now, guys, the book says, Don't Talk About Joe Mack, the life, wars, and secret history of the man behind the Winter Hill Gang. And I've always wondered about this Winter Hill Gang. I've always heard of it, and Whitey Bulger came out of that and was so famous, but I've never really seen anything or know anything about the background of it. And Springs Toledo has somebody, a guy called Joe Mack, that was involved in that, and he's really gone into it in depth. Springs, tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got into this.
I'm a native of Boston, which did help. The accent helped
Yeah,
open doors,
we can tell.
but I don't even try to hide it anymore. And I have a background in boxing, which also helps. That's a breeding ground for leg breakers and enforcers historically, especially in Boston. A lot of ex-fighters became gangsters or involved in that life. I went to Northeastern, got a graduate degree in criminology, and I never became a police officer. I worked with juvenile delinquents and troubled youth for many years. I've written several books, some about boxing, some about an historical figure named John Brown, who's an abolitionist, so I'm running the gamut. But Joe McDonald was a name that I heard whispered for many years growing up. He had a very long criminal career, over 5 decades. And so he was considered something very serious, but what I began to notice as the book started coming out after John Martirano became a cooperating witness, as he'd say, is that not much was known about this individual. What I knew is that he was about 20 years older than everybody else. So he's an elder statesman in that world. So I started poking around. I know some guys who were involved in that life. I know some other guys who are very connected to very serious individuals who were active in the Boston underworld during these years, the 60s, 70s, 80s, into the 90s.
Yeah.
So I started asking around. And the things I started to hear was downright alarming about who this man was, and that he was the guy, not Whitey Bulger. What they'll all tell you, the deeper you get into the operators in that world, is that Whitey Bulger is largely a mythology, and that in Somerville especially, he wasn't really that respected. Joe Mack, however, was. He was a go-to guy. And upon doing all kinds of research, field research, but also I'm trying to corroborate everything people are saying. You can't just take what people have to say at face value, especially if they're underworld figures. A lot of them have a self-interest. So what I would do, I had a little strategy. What I would do is I would talk to one guy in Southie if I heard a story that sounded intriguing or something about Joe Mack or what have you. And then I'd try to find another guy in Somerville or East Boston or Hyde Park who didn't necessarily know that individual. And if the stories match, I'd look into it further. For instance, I want to make sure the guy wasn't in prison at that time, that he's allegedly known to have done something. So that's how I began to put together a picture. And unanimously, what I found out is that Joe McDonald was really he's the one that put together organized crime in Somerville, centered in Winter Hill. He organized the rackets, loan sharking, the booking, sports betting, all of that. And he was a very feared individual. He looked like a building superintendent. He was balding. He was nothing flashy about him. He was a family man. So I started digging deeper, and I got his military records. And then the picture really started to come together because of what he went through during World War II in the South Pacific and the trauma that he suffered. I didn't want to write a straight true crime book. So I wanted to do something different. I didn't want it to be ordinary. I wanted to get underneath the behavior. The criminology major was coming to the fore. So I wanted to get underneath it. So I consider this book more of a nonfiction noir. Because if you watch those old movies, a lot of them have a theme where you have the main character, the anti-hero. These are movies from the 40s, all black and white, all shadowy.
Yeah.
They come back from World War II and they're troubled. They're shell-shocked. Joe Mack came back and he's marred. Something about his personality had changed. And he's one of the few individuals that I've encountered who actually age into crime. He didn't age out of it like everybody else. He aged into it. But he was very good at what he did. He was a brilliant individual, very strong-willed. Someone said that I talked to, they said that all the fear, whatever fear he had was knocked out of him on Savo Sound when his ship went down, which was a USS Quincy with his brother on it.
Mm.
So he began to emerge as a fascinating figure. But what made me decide to write the book was when I was hooked up with his daughter by TJ English. I reached out to him and he told me about Jackie McDonald. I reached out to her and I said, I'm thinking about writing a book about your father, Joe McDonald. I don't think that the literature on him now really got him right. And she said, give me a night to drink about it. Yeah. So the next morning, she told me she'll tell me everything she knows. And she was the right person because first of all, she was named for the brother that he lost in Savo Sound that he never got over, his little brother. Her name's Jacqueline. And like her father, she's absolutely brilliant. She's charismatic. She is incredibly honest. If she's not sure about something, she'd say so. Nothing in it was what she told me was about herself. It was nothing was ego driven. She wanted to tell the truth of her father. And what I began to realize early on is that you have victims of guys like Joe McDonald who killed dozens of people professionally, but he was a murderer. There's no doubt about it. And you have a lot of victims, including in his own family. Not that he intended to hurt his daughters and his son, but who he was and what he was did a lot of damage to his own family. And she was the perfect person to talk to because she was so honest. She's also very funny. If you read about her in the book, she comes across as a real character, very charismatic. So her story runs parallel with his. She comes out about the middle of the book, and I trace her life alongside with his. And she had a memoir that she did many years ago, and she shared that with me. She really is a force of good, if you will, in the book. She's the one to cheer for. She's the one to root for. Joe McDonald is a formidable figure, but he's a dark and shadowy figure. I do bring him out as much as I can, and he is fascinating, but I felt like I needed someone to root for the reader.
Yeah.
And also, it's women who love true crime the most. So
Yeah,
I had to
that's
give a
true.
nod to them. They're going to buy it.
That is true, and a story like this will attract men and women both. Sometimes they'll just straight kill them all and let God sort them out of true crime books that are not really attractive to women. That's really interesting that, you're showing the human side of this guy instead of just the crime side, which every one of these guys that are professional criminals in this life have a human side. That's one thing that fascinated me about them, even way back when I went into the intelligence unit, is these guys all had families and they had kids going to St. Pius up here. They played football and the families all showed up when their kids played football and they were in Little League and all that kind of normal stuff on one hand, but yet they came over into the city, and here they came from the suburbs over in the city and were these gangsters all night long, and then went back home to their suburban homes. So that family side, that's really interesting. I'm glad you did that.
That's compartmentalization. And Joe was the best at it, but there was something unusual about this case, and that is that Joe told nothing to anybody. His Winter Hill partners barely knew about his personal life. They didn't know much about him. Nobody knew much about him because he didn't confide in anybody. He did it the way you're supposed to do it as an organizer. If you're going to get into organized crime, you want to follow his lead. And he lived a tough life. It's nothing to get into in terms of choosing that as an occupation. However, he did confide in his daughters. He trusted them and he told them an awful lot, which he didn't realize was traumatizing them. But Jackie McDonald is blessed with a very good memory. So she was able to fill in a lot of blanks about some of which were cold case murders and other just real eyebrow raising incidents that happened. I think this book would have been invaluable to the FBI, right up to the early 90s because of the stuff that came out. Several cold case murders, I think I solved them. They were attributed, I attribute them to Joe. A few I know he did, but people didn't know. And he was excuse my saying, but he was a real talent for that. He knew how to get you. He knew how to find you and knew how to get you. And he also, like I said, he didn't have any fear, so there was nothing holding him back. And that's a difference from Whitey Bulger. What people don't realize is that Whitey Bulger was a very careful man. And that's why a lot of murders attributed to Whitey Bulger, he didn't do. It offends his personality. He was the kind of guy, if he's going to kill you, you're going to be in the basement tied to a chair, or you're going to be a woman. He's not on Northern Avenue in Boston in broad daylight killing Brian Halloran. It's not true. That's not Whitey Bulger. That's not how he operated. Joe Mack was a different beast altogether, and yet he was never indicted for murder. He was questioned maybe for one of them. And the title is really a reason for that because you didn't talk about Joe Mack. That's I like the title a lot. It took me a long time to get to that title. First title was Hey Joe because of the song. And I was like, nobody said Hey Joe to him.
Where
And
you
then
go with that gun in your hand, huh?
that's right. Good. Yeah, Jimi Hendrix. And then another title was The Wars of Joe Mack. That was a little too masculine. That works, but it was too masculine. Don't Talk About Joe Mack really captures what he was and how he operated.
Springs, set the geographic scene. I've always been a little bit confused about this in Boston. Boston is unlike Kansas City, for example, what I'm familiar with. It has these really distinct areas and neighborhoods. Set the scene. The Italians, African Americans, the Irish. Set that up for us?
Okay, this is the 50s, 60s, 70s. That's where most of the book is occurring, especially 60s, 70s, we're actually into the 80s. Boston, first of all, it's basically back then was an Irish Catholic city.
Yep.
There were other ethnicities, but it was overrun with the Irish, and there were neighborhoods. So you had neighborhood crews. You had crews that were operated out of East Boston. That's Barboza. South Boston was several of them. Jamaica Plain. The North End obviously was where the Mafia was centered, the La Cosa Nostra, Somerville, Charlestown. And most of the guys who got into criminality, not only did they have families, they also had occupations. They were longshoremen, they were roofers, they had jobs, some were policemen. And back then, policemen, you didn't make a lot of money, so you were encouraged to supplement your income.
Oh, yeah.
Some of these guys they were detectives by day and they're doing heists at night. And that was not uncommon. And over time, certain organizations became more organized, and the Irish, remember, were barely organized. It was more like the Old West when things got hot. It was also whiskey driven. A lot of the heinous acts and the murders that started to happen with the Irish gang war in the 60s, everybody was drunk. Some of these guys were really nice guys, and then they got to the whiskey and forget it. They become monsters. Not everybody, but Boston was also very segregated, not like the South. There was natural neighborhoods. I was in Hyde Park. That's where I came up. If I went to Southie, there was a problem because I didn't know a lot of people there. If somebody from Southie went to the North End, it's a problem. You're Irish. You shouldn't be here. You didn't cross boundaries. Mattapan was Jewish and then it became black. Same thing. So everybody congregating together was very tribal in that sense. Less so now, but there are still pockets. What's upsetting to me is that you barely hear the accent when you're walking through Boston. You don't hear the accent too much anymore. You have to get to Dorchester. Their accent's 10 times worse than mine. And mine's pretty bad. But Joe Mack was born in Medford, Massachusetts. He was in Somerville by about 1950. His mother had moved there. His clan, if you will, had moved there. His sisters and brothers, and so he was in Somerville in Winter Hill, and that's where he started to operate, and that's where he started to put things together.
Interesting. You say Winter Hill, so let's talk about the beginnings of this Winter Hill gang. I've heard of this many times, and Whitey Bulger, of course, popularized it. So tell me about the Winter Hill Gang and Howie Carr. And there's a famous picture that see on internet or on Facebook with our underboss Tuffy DeLuna and this guy that was the head of the Winter Hill Gang and a couple other gangsters from New York. So tell us about the beginning of this Winter Hill Gang.
Howie deserves a lot of credit. He's the one that really brought the stuff out beginning in the 80s. He had the guts to mention Joe Mack in print. That's high risk. I'm not sure how much he did it, but he was really attuned to it early, and he had some great books. But Winter Hill's a neighborhood in Somerville. It's not South Boston. You talk to guys who were associated with the Winter Hill Gang, what they called the Hill, really. It was called the Hill by those who were part of that organization. They get very resentful about Whitey Bulger, and some of them will say that Whitey Bulger wasn't Winter Hill. Whitey Bulger was a partner, but he was South Boston. And it's a big story, but it's all in the book, but once he betrayed his partners in 79 with Fleming, and all the partners just about they were all indicted, except for about this big horse racing scheme that was going on across several states. But Whitey and Fleming were unindicted co-conspirators. And that was hint number one. That prompted Joe to go to Howie Winter, who was the face of the organization. and say, I'm going to kill them both. He was talked out of it because it'd be too much heat because Whitey had some very serious connections. You can't take that away from him. And so he was a high risk hit. Joe would have done it anyway and would have probably made him disappear or threw it at another organization to get the heat off the hill. But he was restrained, which was I thought was a big mistake, but who can tell then? But after he cleared the field of his rivals, who were his partners in the Winter Hill gang, he ostensibly should have taken over the rackets in Somerville, but that wasn't really the case. He had Salty, that was his turf. He was a local guy. Salty was really where he was. He was no longer really welcome, is my understanding from guys who I talked to who were there. He was basically chased out of the Marshall Motors garage in Somerville and Winter Hill. And that's when he went to the Lancaster garage in North End, which is closer to home, closer to his base of operations.
Yeah.
But Whitey was very treacherous, and he was a Machiavellian in his methods. Joe at the time was already on the lam because I don't think Whitey would have survived that if Joe was close and saw what he was doing. So it's a lot of what could have been if Joe wasn't in the wind because of several other crimes and murders he was doing at the time. He was actually on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted in 76, long before Whitey was on it.
Interesting. So then the relationship between Howie Carr and Joe Mack, how was that? How did that shake down?
Howie Winter, you mean?
Or Howie Winter, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Howie Winter was mentored by Joe Mack. See, Joe Mack was really, he was like a general. He was like the general on the field. The Irish don't operate in a hierarchy. That's an Italian thing. There's no ring kissing in an Irish pub. It's just a different culture. What they were partners. And you had one guy up front, he was the face of it. That's Howie. Howie was the face of it. Before Howie's Buddy McLean in the early 60s. Joe, though, is the guy in the shadows. He used to say, I'm at the back of the bus. He's at the back of the bus, but he's the one with the map. He's the go-to guy. The guy up front is the guy that gets hit. That's the guy that gets indicted. So Joe was astute enough to just stay in the background, let the kids have it. But they were very close during the war. They were a very tight-knit organization. These were friends. They were very affectionate with each other. They took care of one another. This is before Whitey came in. He poisoned the well. But Joe and Howie and Buddy McLean, the Martiranos, when they come in, they were very close. It was a kind of a band of brothers in a way. But Joe still maintained that everybody was at arm's length with him. He was careful about everybody. There was a rift between Howie and Joe later in their respective lives in the 80s into the 90s. I'm told that it was healed. I don't think it was, and that's unfortunate. But they were close for most of their lives. They literally went to war together on the street. You're going to form strong bonds when you're looking at this guy and you got to rely on him to watch your back, and
Yeah.
that's what was happening.
So the Irish, they didn't kick up, if you will, to somebody above them. Everybody was a kind of an independent operator. If you got a piece of action and you had something going, then you didn't have to kick up to somebody to be part of the Winter Hill gang, if you will.
That was, well, there were a lot of crews around. They were called independents. And there's a lot of them around in Boston in the 60s. But if you got too big and you started making real money, Patriarca was a power in Boston.
Yeah.
Raymond Patriarca, he was a power in Boston. There's no doubt about that. But there's two schools of thought. Some believe that Winter Hill had to always kick up to them, kick to Providence. Others say, no, not really, because first of all, he loved Buddy McLean. Buddy McLean he was a very charismatic guy, very tough guy, and he was a man of his word. So they really liked him. So there's the other school of thought is that they liked Buddy, they gave him a pass on that, but every now and then they'd have to do him favors, maybe do some hits, things like that. Yeah. But again, in Boston, it's like I said, it's mostly Irish. It's not set up like New York, where the Italians are a real power that's right there. One guy, matter of fact, a name of one of the chapters in the book where I get into the Gangland War is Boston was overrun with sick bastards, quote unquote, because there was just so many dangerous guys. There wasn't a few here and there like the Gallows, there were hundreds of guys, and they were damn near psychopathic. They were called in underworld parlance, they were savages. They go right to your house. And there was too many. This one guy, actually several believed that if there was a problem between Rhode Island and the Boston underworld, meaning Boston writ large, including Somerville, Medford, Malden, and all that the Italians would have come to the table because the Irish underworld, the Boston underworld here, would have made it very much not worth it, not worth the blood and the treasure. So so it's very interesting culture here. What you couldn't control the Boston underworld. They would just well,
No.
Boston itself has a reputation. You don't want to invade this place.
Yeah. Just ask the English, huh?
Exactly. Yeah, we go way back with that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, I went into the North End and looked around at Prince Street and all the place where Jerry Angelo and all that was going on, and that is such a small, discrete little area in that. Then so they just operated, and he was not any kind of a real power, it didn't seem to me like, compared to Patriarcha. He was under Patriarcha, of course, and he didn't really it's like the Irish all had their own thing all around him, and
All
he didn't
around
really
him.
have I didn't find anything I've ever seen where there was much to do between those 2. Was there did you have anything about that?
He had two guys. Joe Russo, he was a killer. He was a very serious individual. And a guy who has two names. Some call him Bione, some call him Zanino. Larry was his name. Very serious guy. But that's two guys. The other dangerous guys in the North End, they were getting up there in age. Meanwhile, like you just alluded to, they're surrounded by these crazy guys. Yeah, but there was some interplay. There was some contracts would be given to the Hill, for instance. That happened several times. The Hill would borrow money from Angiulo. Angiulo had a lot of money. They'd borrow money from him. Whitey Bulger borrowed money from him with Flemmy and actually didn't pay it back. And then Joe Mack got out of the can. This is late 86, 87. And him and Howie went to Flemmy and Whitey and said, listen, you're paying them back. Matter of fact, you're paying them back $1 million because you made us look bad. We pay our debts. You pay him, you pay Angiulo back $1 million. And they did. Well, Whitey Bulger did not step to Joe McDonald. In other words, he wasn't the power that Johnny Depp would have us believe.
Interesting. So let's go back to the family just a little bit. His daughter, Jacqueline. So when he went to prison, did she talk about that? I have a friend who went to prison for several years, and he tells me a lot about his kids coming to visit him in prison. Did he talk about that? Did she talk about that? How that affected her?
She talks about her whole life and how he was a shadow in her life. She loved him, but he brought a lot of chains behind him and a lot of ghosts and a lot of fear of FBI raids and things like that. Even when he was on the run from the FBI, he was on the top 10 most wanted. It's on the 6 o'clock news all over the place in every post office. He would just show up and see her. He thought he was being a dutiful father. He's showing up. He's got these black sideburns glued onto his face, and she could see the ink dripping. He's got his rug on his head. He startled her a lot. So he was a cause of great anxiety. And then she became a mother. And then things started to change. She had to protect her boys. And while he looked like he could be a good grandfather, he was an extremely dangerous man. And when he went away to prison, she tried to be a good daughter. She would send him clippings. Matter of fact, she sent him a clipping of, I think it was a National Examiner, because her father was in it. It was about the top 10 FBI fugitives. And she pointed out, she was into astrology, and she pointed out that Joe Mack and another guy named Leo Corey had the same birthday, July 14th. So she thought he'd get a kick out of that. He gets out of prison a few years later, and he shows up at her house with Leo Corey, who's still on the top 10 most wanted. And he opens the door. He said, "Do you remember this guy?" And she turned. That was a very scary moment for her. He's bringing this is a convicted murderer. It's a multiple murderer. He's bringing her to her house like he's an old friend. So that kind of stuff happened a lot. It almost show off like that. Look what I can do. So she did love him, and she has since forgiven him. And I think this book is part of her process to forgive what he put her through and what he put his other children through. Not intentionally. He tried to be a good father, but how can you in that position?
Yeah, yeah. When you bring that violence into the home, and you can't help but bring that aura of violence with you when you live that life. And
Yeah.
when you come back into the home, there's still that edge of violence, that unspoken communication. You jump every time somebody pulls up out in front, and you're running to the window to see who it is, and they're just always on edge. That would be it.
Here's a good story. So he's on the run. This is I think it's the late 60s. Joe's on the run. She's at home. And Joe set his wife and kids up in Malden in a house on the hill. And originally he was going to live there too. And it's a great place. He's on a corner. He's on a hill. You could see Boston from it. So it's got a great vantage point for kind of a paranoid, damaged war veteran.
Yeah.
So a call comes into the house. Voice says, "You know who this is?" She's about 11, 12 years old. Voice says, "You know who this is?" "Yes. Meet me at the bottom of the hill." So she gets her sister Patty, and they meet their dad at the bottom of the hill. He takes them bowling in Saugus. He's got the disguise on. He's got so many IDs, fake IDs, and so they go bowl, and you got to wait for Lane. So he's sitting there like this. He got his arms out. He's feeling good about himself. He's a good dad. He got his two teenage girls here, and one of them was a teenager. And suddenly over the intercom, "Thomas Campbell, your Lane is ready." And he's just sitting there. "Thomas Campbell," he's just sitting there. Finally, his daughter says, Patty says, "Dad, that's you." And off he goes. And so he wasn't even sure who he was half the time.
Yeah.
So he said, my heart went out to him in that sense, because here's a man who made some very dark life choices, and he's trying to be a conventional father. Meanwhile, he's got to keep his eye on the clock, on the door, on the phone, and everything else all day long. Not to mention the fact that it was a dangerous lifestyle. But his daughters, they idolize him and they loved him. They didn't fear him. He never raised his hand to them, never raised his hand to them, but they feared what he brought with him.
Yeah.
And that's a theme of the book.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, that is so interesting. Think about this era of violence. I think somewhere in the book I noticed, I was going through it, where he may have been possibly one of the suspects on the Joe Barboza hit out in San Francisco when they finally got him in the end.
That's fascinating, because actually I had to take out, because of the publisher, I take about 15,000 words, but I really get into that. But that had to go. But what happened was, he had to go out there and kill a federal witness. And this guy was a civilian. This guy looked like a grandfather. But he was going to be a fence for some rare stamps that Joe had taken $1 million worth of rare stamps. And this guy was going to be the fence. He was a rare stamp collector out in Sierra Madre. Long story short, in January of 1976, Joe Mack drives out there, shoots him in the head 5 times in front of his wife. And then in February, that's when Barboza is killed. February 1976. This is January 1976. Now, what I heard from 2 sources, and they're pretty good, is that Joe did not go from Sierra Madre, California, back to Somerville. What he did was he went to Laurel Canyon, and that's where Alex Rocco was staying. Alex Rocco, as the actor who played Mo Green in The Godfather.
No, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, he was a Winter Hill guy. And Joe stayed with him on the lam for so many weeks. I don't know if it's true. I couldn't chase that down. No way you're going to find that out, but it was an intriguing little tidbit. So then in February, Barboza is killed. Now, when that news hit a bar in Boston called Clark's, it was a mob hangout, the bartender who knew all these guys, he got off the phone and he yelled out to the bar, "That bleepity bleep stool pigeon Animal Barboza is dead and gone. God bless Joe Mack." That's what he said. He just assumed Joe Mack did it. So I'm trying to chase that down. And what happens is, so I'm talking to guys, we're talking to guys. And what I found out is that one guy said, no, that wasn't Joe. That was kept in-house among the Italians, because Barboza really took apart the Italians' influence in Boston. Yeah, he took them apart with lies. And there were 3 people in that van. I got the Freedom of Information documents. And what I was told by a made guy, actually, is that it was Russo and Baioni, Zanino. They're the ones that took out Barboza with a shotgun from a van. The van, 2 seats were taken out of the van. The windows were painted black. The side windows were painted black, and peepholes were drilled into the side door and the back. So they worked hard to get him. But there was a 3rd man in the van. So that's a little intriguing. Could it have been Joe? I don't know. Probably not, I'd have to say. Probably not, but nice story. And then from there, and then literally just a few weeks after that, Joe was in disguise. Remember now, he's already on the news as a top 10 fugitive the FBI is looking for. And where is he? He's in Walpole. How did I find out? I got everybody's prison records I could. And Brian Halloran, who turns up later in the book and then turns up dead later in the book, he's in prison. Joe visits him. How do I know? It's Joe's alias, John A. Kelly. That was its alias at the time. So he's wanted by the FBI. He's on the news. And literally a week or 2 later, he's visiting somebody in Walpole State Prison. From there, I trace him to Montreal. What's he doing in Montreal? he's holding up an armored car robbery with the Montreal Express. They had a great program. The Montreal Express and Somerville, what they would do is they would just swap guys to do these big heists, get these armored cars, get these banks, and then just return. So it was awfully hard to catch them because they're just doing like a swap
Yeah.
off. Joe Mack was up there. And what he was doing was it was a white van, which raised an eyebrow, another white van. And the armored car, the guy wouldn't open the door. So they open up the door of the back doors of the white van, and there is a World War II Browning anti-aircraft gun. And guess who's behind it? Joe Mack. So this is a very busy man, but he's retirement age. But did he kill Barboza? Probably not, but there was a third guy there. I would not be surprised. I know the Italians used.
You brought something, the Montreal Express. Now, what's that? I've not heard that term before.
I wasn't either, but a lot
Seems
of
like
guys
there's a
told me.
story there.
Yeah, there is. Yeah, they were bank robbers. They went for the armored trucks. That was their forte. Very well organized, very skilled. They were specialized, and they would swap off with Winter Hill, sometimes with Southie and South Boston, I should say. South Boston and Somerville they were very close. They were very much aligned, and they would swap off. I think one of them was the brother of a Bruins hockey player. Yeah.
Interesting. These guys, they got their connections. I found out more and more since I started doing this podcast, how many connections people had between cities and even within a city, connections to regular, look like square John businessmen and just connections all over the place. It's
all over the place. Matter of fact, Joe was in contact with the guys who escaped from Alcatraz. I couldn't prove it, but I heard that he was sending them money and supporting them. I didn't find nearly 50% of what Joe was up to, but that's more than anybody else. I think before this book, we knew about 2% of what he was up to.
He was a pretty low-key guy.
Sure, yeah. He was a footnote in most of the books, just a footnote, if that. So
that's the smart one, the one that keeps his head down and keeps out of the papers and everything. Did you talk to John Monterano?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I did. First thing he said was how much he loved them. All these guys, very serious guys, very powerful guys in the underworld. And when I brought his name up, the ones who were close to him, they would say, I love that man, loved him. They loved and revered him. Other guys who were not as close to him, but who were very operatives in the Boston underworld, I'd bring his name up. Now, he's been gone since 1997, and they'd look around like this. And they'd say, oh, gee. Yeah. So, his name was still enough to, and matter of fact, I was told early on when I was poking around that I'm poking around in dangerous places, and Joe still has friends, and you don't want to cross these guys. So even now, his shadow still looms, if you will. But I think he'd approve of what I did, because what I heard is that he's very honest. He would not want any biographer to pull punches about who and what he was. I didn't. But some of his friends warned me, you got to be careful with this. But I call it bachelor's privilege. I'm not married. I have no kids. If I end up in a ditch, who cares? So I can take risks.
Yeah. And some truth, it's just that last few minutes before you done the dish, you go, oh shit, I wish I was anywhere but here.
I would have to talk to a priest. Let me get a confession. That's what you got to do.
You'd be like, I think it was Tony Spilotro, supposedly the story was he wanted to know if he could say a quick prayer before they did him in. But
I hope they let him.
Steve Fleming, you mentioned about Steve Fleming, the rifleman who was Whitey's buddy, and I think you mentioned you had a story about Steve Fleming.
Steve Fleming it's interesting. He doesn't appear too much in the book. One of the things I had to do with this, I had to do my best to keep the names down. One of a fatal flaw in a whole lot of Boston Underworld books, and any Underworld books, is there is just 8,000 names.
Too many names.
So there's too many names. So I mentioned him a few times because you have to, but I'm not focused on Fleming. But I can tell you that Joe was very suspicious of Fleming as early as he was very suspicious of Whitey. He respected him. Fleming was a killer, more of an ambush killer than a savage or a guy who took a lot of risks. He was a lot like Whitey like that. But no, Joe didn't trust him because he had a long bid and he got out early. And that's always a cause for concern among those guys. Why are you out early? They got a story, and the story's backed up by the government. They're already in cahoots.
Yeah.
But with the names, there was one guy, this is an example. He was actually an MDC cop who was part of the Winter Hill gang in the early 60s. And his name was Russ Nicholson. I don't want to keep saying Russ Nicholson, the cop. So I shortened it to Russ the cop. And then as things went on and the police department realized that this guy's involved in the rackets, they forced him to resign So then I started calling him Rusty X Cop. Then Rusty X Cop gets clipped, probably by Georgie McLaughlin. He's dead. So now he's Russ the Dead X Cop. So I'm trying to be polite to the reader and keep the names down.
Interesting. That's a good idea. I know about that. That people say, "I love what you did, but there's too many names. I got confused
Mhm.
too." So
Yeah.
it's always
So
a problem with these deals. All right, Springs Toledo. Let's see. All of a sudden, I lost. There it is. There you go, guys. And guys, I will have his link for all his books and the show notes, and of course links to my books too. But links to all of these books. You had some even about John Brown. You want to go back into a little Civil War history? Why, check those out too, guys. So thanks so much for coming on the show.
my pleasure. My pleasure. My pleasure. My pleasure. My pleasure.